Welcome back to Social Science class, History, chapter number 2, Russian Revolution. As this is the third part of the chapter Russian Revolution, let us recapitulate the previous topic which we have done in the second part, the First World War and the Russian Revolution. As in 1914, the First World War broke out between two European alliances. On one side, Germany, Austria and Turkey, and this group was named as the Central Powers. And on the other side, there were France, Britain and Russia, which was joined later by Italy and Romania, are known as Allies powers. In Russia, the First World War was initially very popular, but later the support grew thin. There were many reasons for this thin support during the First World War in Russia. Anti-German sentiments ran high. Russian armies lost badly in Germany and Austria. The war also affected the industries. There was labor shortage. By 1916, railway lines began to break down. The small workshops were closed down. There was shortage of grain and hence of bread, which was the staple food of Russia. Due to all these circumstances, the revolution took place, and the Russian Revolution took place in two phases: February Revolution and October Revolution. The February Revolution in Petrograd, the previous capital of Russia, in 1917. In the winter of 1917, conditions in the capital, Petrograd, were grim. The layout of the city seemed to emphasize the divisions among its people, and the workers' quarters and factories were located on the right bank of the river Neva, and on the left bank there was the quarters or the areas of the fashionable people. Fashionable people here means the richer class people. In February 1917, food shortages were deeply felt in the workers' quarters. The winter was very cold and there had been exceptional frost and heavy snow. In the meantime, the parliamentarians wishing to preserve elected government were opposed to the Tsar's desire to dissolve the Duma, due to which on 22nd February a lockout took place at a factory on the right bank. The next day, the workers in 50 factories called a strike in sympathy. In many factories, women led the way to strike. This came to be called the International Women's Day. Demonstrating workers crossed from the factory quarters to the center of the capital, the Nevsky Prospect. At this stage, no political party was actively organizing the movement. As the fashionable quarters and the official buildings were surrounded by workers, the government imposed a curfew. Demonstrators dispersed by the evening, but they came back on the 24th and 25th. The government called out the cavalry and the police to keep an eye on them. Then, on Sunday, 25th February, the government suspended the Duma. Duma was the parliament of Russia. Politicians spoke out against the measure. This step, demonstrators returned in force to the streets of the left bank on the 26th. On the 27th, the police headquarters were ransacked. The streets thronged with people raising slogans about the bread, wages, better hours, and democracy. The government tried to control the situation and thus called out the cavalry once again. However, now this time, the cavalry refused to fire on the demonstrators. An officer was shot at the barracks of a regiment and three other regiments mutined, voting to join the striking workers. Then, by the evening, soldiers and striking workers they gathered to form a council which was named as Soviet. This was referred as, or this was later called as Petrograd Soviet. The very next day, a delegation, a group of people, the high class people, the responsible ones, went to see the Tsar. Military commanders advised him to abdicate. To whom? Tsar. He followed their advice and abdicated on 2nd March. Soviet leaders and Duma leaders formed a provisional government to run the country. Russia's future would be decided by a constituent assembly from now onward, elected on the basis of universal adult suffrage. Petrograd had led the February Revolution that brought down the monarchy in February 1917. Here you can see the Petrograd Soviet, which was formed after 1917 February Revolution on the basis of universal adult suffrage. After this February Revolution, there were many effects. The effects of the February Revolution were like the restrictions on the public meetings and associations were removed and Soviets were set up everywhere. In April 1917, the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia and he introduced April Thesis. Under April Thesis, there were three conditions, three demands: war to be brought to an end, land to be transferred to the peasants, and the banks to be nationalized. These April Theses are often asked in the examination in 3-marker. In individual areas, factory committees were formed which began questioning the way industrialists ran their factories. Soldiers' committees were formed in the army, and the provisional government saw its power declining and Bolshevik influence grow. Therefore, it decided to take stern measures against the spreading discontent. It resisted attempts by the workers to run factories and arrested leaders. Peasants and the socialist revolutionary leaders pressed for a redistribution of the land. Thus, the land committees were formed and the peasants seized land between July and September 1917. The Bolshevik Lenin, addressing the workers in April 1917 and introducing his three demands, April Thesis. Then started the second phase of the revolution of October 1917. As the conflict between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks grew, Lenin feared the provisional government would set up a dictatorship. So, in September, he began discussion for an uprising against the government. Bolshevik supporters in the army, Soviet and factories were brought together. In this sequence, on 16th October 1917, Lenin persuaded the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolshevik Party to agree to a socialist seizure of the power. A military revolutionary committee was appointed by the Soviet under Leon Trotsky to organize the seizure. The date of the event was kept secret. The uprising began on 24th October. Sensing the trouble, the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister was Kerensky at that time, had left the city to summon troops. At dawn, Military men loyal to the government, they seized the buildings of two Bolshevik newspapers. Pro-government troops were sent to take over the telephone and the telegraph offices and protect the Winter Palace. In response, the military revolutionary committees ordered its supporters to seize the government offices and arrest ministers. Late in the day, the ship Aurora shelled the Winter Palace, and other vessels also sailed down the Neva and took over the various military points. And by the nightfall, the city was under the committee's control and the ministers had surrendered. At the meeting of All Russian Congress of Soviets in Petrograd, the majority approved the Bolshevik action. Uprising took place in other cities also, and there was heavy fighting, especially in Moscow. But by December, the Bolsheviks controlled the Moscow-Petrograd area. Now there was the rule of Bolshevik party. What changes were seen after October Revolution? After October Revolution, the changes or the effects. The Bolsheviks totally opposed to private property, as the ruling party now was the Bolsheviks. So they totally opposed to the private property. Most industries and banks were nationalized in November 1917. The land was declared social property and peasants were allowed to seize the land of the nobility. Use of old titles of aristocracy was banned, and the new uniform was designed for the army and official. The new uniform, which was under the new uniform, the Soviet hat was the new introduction, which was named as Budanovka. The Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks conducted the elections to the Constituent Assembly, but they failed to gain the majority support. Though in January 1918, the Assembly rejected Bolshevik measures and Lenin dismissed the Assembly. In March 1918, despite opposition by their political allies, the Bolsheviks made peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk, and thus Russia became a one-party state. Often this question comes in one marker also, that where the peace treaty was signed in Germany by Bolshevik. The trade unions were kept under the party control. The secret police was organized, named as Cheka, and the secret police used to punish those who criticized the Bolsheviks. Young writers and artists rallied to the party because the party stood for socialism and change. After October 1917, this led to experiments in the art and architecture, but many became disillusioned, disappointed because of censorship the party has encouraged. Due to all these steps taken by the Bolsheviks, ultimately the civil war was created in Russia. When the Bolsheviks ordered the land redistribution, the Russian army began to break up because the soldiers, mostly those who were peasants, wished to go home for the redistribution and deserted. Non-Bolshevik socialist liberals and supporters of autocracy condemned the Bolshevik uprising, and their leaders moved to South Russia and organized troops to fight the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were referred as the Reds, and during 1918 and 1919. The socialist revolutionary were referred as Greens and the pro-Tsarist, the supporters of Tsar, were referred as Whites. They controlled most of the Russian Empire. They were backed by French, American, British, and Japanese troops. All those forces who were worried at the growth of socialism in Russia. As these troops and the Bolsheviks fought a civil war, looting, banditry, and famine became common in Russia. Supporters of private property took harsh steps against the peasants who had seized land, which led loss of popular support for the non-Bolsheviks. Thus, by January 1920, Bolsheviks controlled most of the former Russian Empire due to the cooperation with non-Russian nationalists and Muslim jihadists. But in Khiva, in Central Asia, Bolsheviks colonists brutally massacred local nationalists in the name of defending socialism, due to which many were confused about the Bolsheviks' representation, and as people were confused that whether they need to support the Bolshevik or not. Partly to remedy this situation, most of the non-Russian nationalities were given political autonomy in the Soviet Union USSR. USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the state which was created by Bolshevik from the Russian Empire on 30th December 1922.